So this is the equivalent, the medieval equivalent of putting nails through your baseball bat. Do I give this a D? Lots and lots of crushing, bludgeoning damage.
And I'd be terrified of that too. Hello, I'm Matt Lewis, medieval historian and co-host of History Hits Gone Medieval podcast. I'm here today to try to rank some medieval weapons. So I've got a board in front of me that goes from D, C, B, all the way to A, with an S lane at the top for anything that gets above an A. I'm going to work my way through a selection of weapons that I've been given, and I'm going to think about how usable they were, how much damage they might do. Would I actually want to go into battle using one of these things on a medieval battlefield? Doubtless I will make mistakes in your eyes. So if you think I've got something wrong here, if you think there is a weapon that you would think is better or worse than I've ranked it, please let me know in the comments below and tell me where I've got this all horrendously wrong. But in the meantime, I'm going to dive in and start ranking medieval weapons. First up, I have got a dagger. I mean, these have been around almost since the beginning of time. People have been sharpening straight things to hurt other people with. Medieval knights and men-at-arms and even archers probably wouldn't feel properly equipped unless they went into battle with a dagger, but it probably wouldn't be their main weapon during any fighting. There are lots of uses for the dagger. Mainly it's to deliver the coup de grace, the killing blow at the end of a fight. And that would usually be where an archer or a man-at-arms would drive the point of a dagger through the visor of a helmet into someone's eye, through into the brain, to finish them off and make sure that they're dead. So you get lots of really thin-bladed daggers designed specifically for that purpose. And in fact, the dagger that we're looking at has this flattened top on it, which is designed specifically for thumping down on the top of it to drive it home. But how am I going to rate a dagger? Well, I'm going to think about, with all of these weapons, three key elements of them. The usability. So I think a dagger is eminently usable. It's a small thing that you would hold in your hand. It's light, it's easy to wield, but it doesn't have any kind of range to it really. You're relying on someone being close to you. Although most often this is going to be used against a prone enemy who's already been felled. So I'm probably going to give this an 8 out of 10 for usability. Almost anybody should be able to use a dagger. We're going to think about the damage that these things could do. In the case of a dagger, I think that's quite limited. It's a small weapon. It doesn't have too much range. It's designed for killing people in a quite specific way in lots of cases, so might not be good in general combat. You could hurt someone with this, but it's probably more difficult to kill them with this than with lots of the other weapons that you would come across in the medieval period. So I'm going to give this a 4 out of 10 for damage. And the other thing we're going to think about with each of these is its versatility. Can it do more than one thing? A dagger, I think, is quite restricted in what it can do. They tend to be a secondary weapon or a weapon that's used for very specific purposes to finish people off in the battle. So it lacks a little bit of versatility. It gives you almost no defensive property. So I'm going to have to give this a 2 out of 10 for versatility. Ranking the dagger, I'm probably going to put this on my C lane. You would want one if you're going into a medieval fight. It's not going to be your main weapon, but you would probably want to have one on your belt in case you ever needed it. The next weapon is an axe. This is a very shiny new axe. This is definitely not a medieval axe. But axes, again, have been around almost from the beginning of time. People have been crafting these things to chop things with. And humans being what humans are, it's not long before you extend that to chopping at people. These are quite often associated with Anglo-Saxon period, early medieval, Vikings using axes, but we do see them continuing into the high medieval period. And this is also a really solid peasant weapon in the sense that everyone will have an axe at home, and this is something that will feel familiar in your hand. You're used to wielding this in your day-to-day job, chopping the firewood for home. So it's not something alien when you go onto a battlefield. If you're not a soldier, you want to have something that gives you a little bit of an edge, and an axe will give you a bit of an edge. You know how to cause damage with this. You'll just be aiming it at a person instead of a block of wood. If we think about its versatility, it's quite usable in your hand. It gives you a little bit more range than the dagger that we've already looked at, but it's still quite limited. You've only got one cutting surface, so you have to hit people with this sharp part of it. The staff of it, I guess you could use in some kind of defensive way, but it's also wood. So I guess in terms of its versatility, I'm going to give this a 5.
It's pretty good at chopping and hacking, but not too great for anything else. In terms of the damage that it would give, if you know how to wield one of these and you can get your aim right, this is going to do some serious damage to someone. This is capable of taking off limbs and causing fatal injuries in people. And given that people were able to use it quite well, I think I'm going to have to give this something like a 7 out of 10 for damage. And if we think about the ease of use of an axe like this, it should be something, again, that almost anybody in a medieval period would be able to wield an axe. They would know how to use this. It's a farm implement. It's an implement you would have at home, so it should be easy for people to use. I'm probably going to give this an 8 out of 10 for usability. And it's a fairly strong, ubiquitous kind of weapon throughout the medieval period. I'm thinking of a B or an A, so I'm not quite sure where I'm going to rank this. I think, without knowing what else is to come, I'm going to give this a solid B. It's kind of a good weapon to have in your arsenal if you're going into a medieval battle. The next weapon that we have is an arming sword. These are known as in the later medieval periods. But swords, again, have been around throughout the early medieval period. They famously existed in the ancient world as well. These weren't new weapons in the medieval period. The styles of them change, so you get longer blades that are slightly narrower and that narrow more to a point. And this, I think, is the weapon that most people will probably think of when they think of a medieval fight. You imagine knights in shining armor. In fact, this is not a great sword for a knight to use against another knight, because if someone is encased in armor, this isn't going to do a very good job of getting through that armor or doing any damage to that armor. Armor is designed to defend against swords, so it becomes a slightly pointless weapon against knights, and perhaps something that you would look to use more against less well-armoured men-at-arms. So in terms of its usability, this is something that not many people would have access to. Knights and noblemen would train with one of these day in and day out. The rest of the population would probably never wield a sword. They wouldn't expect to own a sword. It's quite an expensive piece of equipment. So not everybody would be able to use this. If you can use it, then they're designed to be well balanced in your hand. The length of the blade and the weight of the pommel is designed so that the weapon is comfortable in your hand and nice and easy to swing. So if you get a good sword, it should be a very, very usable weapon. If you're not used to it, you're perhaps going to struggle with it a little bit more. So I guess I'll give this a 7 out of 10 for usability. In terms of the damage that it will do, clearly you can run someone through with this, you can hack and slash, you can do all kinds of injury to them. And this is a weapon that is capable of killing someone quite easily, particularly if they're not wearing armor. Where it falls down, again, is against those armored foes where you're going to struggle to do too much damage to anybody who's wearing some serious armor. So in terms of damage, I think I'm probably going to give this a 7 out of 10 as well. Versatility is an interesting one. So we often think of swords simply being held and swung around. But we do see examples of these being used in conjunction with a shield. So this gives you a spare hand that can also hold a shield to add to your defense. But we do see examples too of people holding swords in different ways. So you can hold a sword by the handle and the point end and then use it as a defensive weapon to block blows that are coming in. You can hold the point end of it and you can swing the handle end and hit people with the pommel, which then becomes something like a crushing weapon. So in terms of its versatility, I'm probably going to give this a good 8 out of 10, I think. I mean, this is such a ubiquitous and famous medieval weapon that in the right hands could be wielded with skill and do immense amounts of harm and damage. I'm probably going to put this on an A. I'm umming and erring between A and B again, but I think I'm going to put that in an A. The two-handed sword, so the Zweihander in Germany, and these swords develop a little further into the medieval period, so the 12th century onwards. We see swords getting bigger, and the extension tends to be more in the handle than it is in the blade length. The blades aren't necessarily all that much longer than a normal sword, but the idea is that you can wield this with two hands to cause more damage when you're using it. These are less common than a one-handed sword. You do get variations that are called hand-and-a-half swords, sometimes referred to as bastard swords. And again, that introduces another layer of complexity into the whole sword issue. But two-handed swords, I think, are the things that we associate most with the tank knight on the battlefield, someone who's raging around swinging this and causing immense amounts of damage. So how are we going to rate this? I feel like this is something you're going to have to learn to use quite specifically. You're going to have to invest time in understanding how to manage the size and the weight of this kind of weapon. It's not something that everyday people would come across. It's quite a specialist weapon, I think. We often see it forming parts of the armies of Swiss and German mercenaries, the Landsknecht in particular, who were famous for using their great big two-handed swords. But they would train soldiers who knew what they were doing. This isn't something I think that anybody could pick up and know how to use. So I'm going to give this probably a 4 out of 10 for its usability. In terms of the damage, this is probably where this might even trump a normal sword. You would expect, with 2 hands on that and the weight that you're pulling it down with, you would expect to be able to get much more force behind this blade and therefore do much more damage to it when it does make contact. So I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10 for the damage that you could do with this, I think. In terms of its versatility, this builds on the idea that a sword can be used in many ways because you've got something that's almost the length of a staff or a spear here. Again, you can move your hands along the hilt to change the position of the weight and the leverage and the force. You can hold the blade to use it as an item to block blows that are coming in. Again, you can hold the blade and you can smash people with the pommel and the handle, so it becomes a bludgeoning weapon. So I feel like this has much more to offer than a normal sword in terms of its versatility. I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10 for versatility. But I think what's going to hold me back a little bit in terms of ranking this is going to be the specialism of wielding it. So I think I'm going to put this in a B. I like a two-handed sword. I think they look cool. I'm not quite sure how cool they are to actually use. And the next medieval weapon that we have is the Mace. So this is an interesting variation on a sword that has an awful lot of mythology around it. This emerges in Germany in the later medieval period, and it's distinctive because the handle is formed in a way of a knife rather than a normal sword. So you see might be able to just make out on the picture, the tang of the blade here is sandwiched between 2 pieces of wood. That's a construction of a knife rather than a sword. It would have a tang that would come to a point inside the handle. So they're constructed slightly differently. There's a bit of mythology around these that they grew up from the fact that German cities and towns banned common people, those below the nobility, from carrying swords. And so they got around this law by inventing this Mace, saying, I'm not carrying a sword, officer, what I'm carrying is a knife. There's lots of doubt over whether that's the real origin of the Mace or whether it's simply a different way to build a sword, an extension of a knife into becoming a sword. They tend to be one-sided on the blade, though we do see 2-sided versions. They tend to have prominent handguards. These, I think, are just a variant of a sword, but quite an interesting weapon with lots of mythology and story and debate that goes on around Maces today. And if we were going to try and rate this, I think in terms of its usability, again, it should be fairly familiar if you know how to use a sword, but probably not if you don't. So this is going to be a specialist weapon of someone trained. So in terms of a mark out of 10 for its usability, I'm going to give this a 6. I think you still have to have invested some time in learning how to use it. In terms of the damage that it could do, this is going to be on a par with a normal sword, really. Perhaps slightly reduced by the fact that it might only have one cutting edge to it. You can still thrust effectively using it. So I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10 for the amount of damage that it would do. And then in terms of its versatility, I think we've taken a step back from the two-handed sword here. This is a slightly less versatile weapon. You can still use it in all of those creative ways, but this is really designed to be used as a sword in the hand. So in terms of its versatility, I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10. And I think I'm going to place the Mace on the B rank, I think, on a par with a two-handed sword. And the next weapon that we have to think about is the Flail. And the Flail is a really, really interesting weapon. This evolves from what is essentially a peasant tool again. So similar principle to the axe. This would be used on a farm for threshing wheat in the fields. What people did is add these spikes to it. So this is the equivalent, the medieval equivalent of putting nails through your baseball bat to turn something you have around the home into a weapon that you can then go and fight somebody with. This would have the benefit, again, similar to axes, that people, peasants, would be used to using this. They would know the weight of it in their hand. They would be used to swinging this around. They would know the range of it. They would understand the weight of it quite well. I think the issue with this is going to come from the fact that essentially you've got a lug of metal there on a chain, which could ultimately become slightly unpredictable. And so if we think about how we might rate this weapon, in terms of its usability, again, it's going to depend who you are. If you're a peasant, this is going to be a highly usable weapon. You would know how to use this. You use this as part of your working day all of the time. Your medieval knight might be less used to a weapon like this, perhaps. But given that the vast majority of people are peasants, just like us, I'm going to give this a usability rating of 9 out of 10. I think this is something that a lot of peasants would know how to use. They would feel comfortable using it, and they would perhaps feel pretty dangerous on a battlefield with one of these. In terms of the damage that it would do, this is going to do lots and lots of crushing, bludgeoning damage. So we're not looking to pierce people in the same way as we might with a sword. The spikes would definitely cause some damage, but effectively you're looking to swing this and knock people off balance or crush them to the ground. So I think in terms of the damage that, if you're good with this, you could deliver, it's probably quite substantial. There's a lot of weight behind it. So I'm probably going to go for an 8 out of 10 for damage. In terms of its versatility, I think this might be where this falls down a little bit. It's not an incredibly versatile weapon. You have, I guess, you've got this big pole here that you could use to defend yourself if you really needed to. But essentially, you're going to have to be standing in the middle of a load of people, swinging this around and desperately trying to hit the right people. I'd be slightly worried about hitting the person behind me while I'm taking a swing to get the person in front of me. So in terms of its versatility, I'm probably going to give this a 4 out of 10. In terms of where to put this, again, I feel like this is something, if you're a peasant, this is going to be a great choice of weapon for you. So this is almost the peasant's equivalent of a sword, I guess, something that you're familiar with using, but that you're confident would cause damage on the battlefield. It's maybe on a par with an axe, so it could be on the B rank, but I'm wondering whether we just go A and call this the medieval peasant's equivalent to the knight's sword, and perhaps it could do a little bit more damage than an axe could at longer ranges.
So the next weapon that we've got to think about is the Poleaxe. Now this is getting really interesting. So the Poleaxe is really a development of a weapon that fits on the end of a long wooden shaft, and you have this whole arrangement of ways to hurt people on the other end. You have a small axe, which distinguishes the Poleaxe from the halberd, which will have a much longer, wider axe on the top there. But you've got a point at the top of it, so you've got something you can use to stab people with. You've got this almost pick-like item on the back of it too, so something else that you can cause severe amounts of damage to people with. The other thing that I want to talk about with the Poleaxe is the billhook. So throughout the 14th and 15th century, we see billhooks becoming common weapons, and they sort of evolve into poleaxes and polearms. And billhooks are essentially another example of a peasant tool that can be taken off the farm and used in battle. They're designed for pruning trees, but they also have this arrangement of blades and hooks and all sorts of bits and pieces that are actually incredibly good ways to hurt people. So this is an adaptation of a farm tool used by common soldiers, which gets refined and made into something that's much more of the weapon of a nobleman, and an expensive weapon and hard to wield. And how do we rate this? So in terms of its usability, again, if you're a commoner, this is going to be something you'd be used to wielding in your day job on the farm. If you're a nobleman and you've learned how to use something like a poleaxe, you're going to be capable of wielding this too. So I think for almost anybody, this is going to be an incredibly usable weapon. I'm going to give it a strong 9 out of 10 for its usability. In terms of the damage that it could do, on both the billhook and the poleaxe, there are so many different ways that you can hurt someone with this. I think this is going to cause immense amounts of damage in all sorts of ways. You can imagine thrusting that into somebody, pulling it out and catching them with a spike, and then taking a smash at them with the axe side of it as well, all while keeping yourself at a very safe distance. So I think this is going to cause a lot of damage. I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10 for the damage that it could cause. And in terms of its versatility, I mean, this is going to score strongly on this because there are just so many different ways that you can use this. Again, you can use the shaft as a defensive weapon if you want to, but you're maintaining your range. You can hold it at quite a distance from the enemy. You can use it for jabbing from inside tightly packed ranks of men, but you can also swing it effectively to make use of the axe and the point and the beak on the end of it. So I think I'm going to give this a 10 out of 10 for versatility. I don't think there's anything that we're going to see that I would think would be more versatile than either the billhook or the poleaxe. And so in terms of where to rank this, if I'm heading onto a medieval battlefield, I think it's pretty clear this might be a weapon that I'm going to choose to take with me because I can use it in so many different ways and cause so much different damage with it. I think this is going to have to go on my S lane up here. I think this is going to have to be my above A grade superior weapon. Perhaps it's my choice to go onto a medieval battlefield with. And the one we have up next is the Warhammer. It's not dissimilar perhaps from other weapons that we've seen. These can come on a short or a long handle. And effectively it has a flat edge on one side, which we'd use as a hammer to cause bludgeoning damage, and this long beak on the back of it, often called a crow's beak, which is used to cause piercing damage. So you've got the option to spin this round and to do different things with it. I think this is a really useful weapon. It's maybe not quite as good as our poleaxe or our billhook. It's lacking some of the elements of that, but maybe that makes it lighter and slightly easier to wield in some situations. So how are we going to rate this on our measures? In terms of its usability, I think it's fairly usable. They're reasonably light. All of the weight is at this end, and you've got a long stick to wield it on the end of. The idea of wielding axes and hammers, as we've talked about, is fairly common in the medieval world, so this wouldn't feel like an alien item. So I think this is fairly usable. I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10 for usability. In terms of the damage that it would cause, again, slightly more limited than our poleaxe maybe, but it still has some of the elements of that you can cause damage in different ways, and that might depend on who you're fighting with the weapon. You may wish to crush parts of someone's armor, you may wish to pierce people who have slightly less armor on. And a long shaft like this is going to give you plenty of purchase, plenty of leverage to get some weight behind it. So I think I'm going to give this a solid 7 out of 10 for the damage that we could cause with this. In terms of the versatility of a warhammer, you can use the shaft as a defensive weapon if you need to. You can keep your range from your enemy, or you can get up close if you really, really want to. So I think there's plenty of versatility in there. I think I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10 for its versatility. Having said that, do you know what? I slightly struggle with the idea of a warhammer. So compared to some of the other weapons on here, it's probably not the thing I'm going to be picking to go into battle with. So potentially controversial. I haven't given anything a D yet. Do I give this a D? Or is that being a little bit too mean to the warhammer? I don't know, let me know what you think. I'm going to give it a C, I think. I think I'm going to put this in my C lane and say it probably isn't something I would want to go into battle with, although I can see plenty of reasons why people might choose that one. Our next medieval weapon to think about is the mace. Although in some ways this is a bit more like a Morning Star than an actual mace. You would tend to think of a mace having kind of flanged edges of metal up the top here, rather than this ball with spikes on it. But nevertheless, a mace is a really important medieval weapon. For some people, better than a sword. It has an important advantage that the sword lacks, and that's that if you're fighting a knight who's wearing armor, you can't penetrate that armor with a sword. You can bash on him as long as you like and you're going to cause absolutely no damage. What you do with a mace is you aim for the joints in people's armor, and the idea then is to crush the joints. If you crush the shoulder joint so that I can't raise my arm, I can't fight you anymore. If you crush my breastplate into my stomach, well, I can't breathe properly anymore. If you crush the armor on my leg, I can no longer walk properly, can't run and chase you in my armor. So I think the mace offers an important weapon for the battlefield that is perhaps similar to a sword, but in many ways superior. This might be the weapon that a knight in armor would choose to fight against another knight in armor with. The sword is going to do him no good there. That's okay if you're fighting people with much less armor, but someone who is encased in steel, you're probably going to go straight to your mace and want to pull this out. But if we were going to rate it on our system, in terms of its usability, I think this is a fairly usable item. It's a heavy lump of metal on the end of a shaft. Most people should be able to use that, similar to wielding an axe, similar to wielding a hammer. Perhaps if you're not used to the weight of a mace, you might have to get used to that. But I think this is a fairly usable item. I'm going to give this a good 8 out of 10 for usability. In terms of the damage that you can cause, I think this is an important edge that a mace has, in that it can cause damage to a knight who's encased in armor by crushing those joints on his armor and preventing him from being able to operate on the battlefield. But it can also cause damage to people out of armor, in that it can crush their bones as well. So I think it has an important edge over the sword, if you'll forgive the pun. It lacks the edge of a sword, but it has an edge over a sword. So in terms of the damage that this could deliver, I'm going to give this, I think I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10. In terms of its versatility, maybe that's where a mace falls down. There aren't too many different ways that you can use it. You're swinging the heavy end and trying to hit someone with that. I think that's the limit of what you can do with a mace. So in terms of its versatility, I'm probably going to give it a 4 out of 10, and maybe that's its downfall slightly. Having said that, if I'm going into battle, I think I might quite like a mace. You don't have to change weapons to fight between someone who's in armor and out of armor. You can cause plenty of damage to almost anybody on a battlefield. Do you know what? I feel like this might be another candidate for my S lane and end up with too many super weapons in the medieval world, I think. But I think it has an edge over a sword, and having put a sword in the A range, I think I'm going to have to put it above that. The next medieval weapon we have to think about is, well, this is a morning star. Although, again, quite often morning stars are the ball of metal on the end of the shaft, and we don't always see the chains that are included in this one. I think I would be slightly terrified in the way that I'm terrified when I watch martial arts films and they get nunchucks out or something. This is spiky balls flailing around with almost no control over them. I think I'd be worried about hurting myself as much as I'd be worried about hurting anybody else. But nevertheless, also terrifying if you see them coming the other way, and would cause an awful lot of damage to you. There's crushing damage from the solid metal ball, but the spikes will add some penetrating damage to it too. This is going to cut and lacerate wherever it makes contact with skin. So a morning star with a chain, in terms of its usability, absolutely terrifying. I would not want to use it. I feel like I would want at least 50 years of training before I went anywhere using this in anger. So I'm going to give this a generous 2 out of 10 for its usability. Sure, if you know how to use it, it's fine. I don't, and I would be terrified. In terms of the damage you could cause, I might have to balance the fact that you could cause both cutting and penetrating damage to your opponent with the fact that you could very easily do the same to yourself. And I'd be terrified of that too. So I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10. In terms of its versatility, I don't think it has much versatility to it. It does one thing. It swings those metal balls around and tries to hit somebody with them. It doesn't give you many options for what else you can do with it. So I'm going to give this, I'm going to give it 1 out of 10 for versatility. I think I may be filling the vacant lane at the bottom. I think I've talked myself into not wanting to go into battle with a morning star because I'd be slightly terrified that the wound I sustained at the end, I would have to come up with some lie about it being an act of bravery because I've hit myself in the stomach with my own morning star. So I'm going to have to put that on my D lane. I don't want a morning star, at least not the version with the chains on like that. Thank you very much. The next weapon that we have to think about is a falchion. So this is another variation on the sword. These are really common throughout the medieval period. We see them in lots and lots of medieval art. The falchion is usually single-edged. It's often curved slightly. We get different variations. They can widen out towards the end. They can have all sorts of different shapes to the blade. And they're essentially designed to cleave and to stab in the same way as a sword. But again, they have that restriction, similar to the Messer, I guess, of being single-edged in most cases. In terms of how we might rate a falchion, in terms of its usability, again, it's a fairly specialist weapon because you've got to add to the fact that you know how to use a sword to the fact that you understand how to wield a one-edged, single-edged sword in many cases with a falchion, which adds another layer of complexity to understanding it. So I think in terms of its usability, I'm probably going to give this a 5 out of 10. It's maybe somewhere in the middle. Fairly easy to use if you know how to use a sword, I guess. In terms of the damage that you could do, I mean, it would do similar damage to a sword, albeit you've lost one edge in many cases. I think I'm going to give this a solid 7 out of 10 for the damage that it could do. It could definitely hurt someone if you were to catch them right with it. In terms of its versatility, I don't think this is a particularly versatile weapon. That single edge reduces the ways in which you can use it. It does have the handguard, you've got the pommel, again, you could use as a pummeling weapon. But I think in terms of its versatility, I'm probably going to give a falchion a 6 out of 10. I kind of don't like falchions. They seem to be everywhere, and I can see that lots of people use them and like them, and I can see that they could be an effective weapon. It's never going to be my pick. I mean, alongside it, maybe the Morningstar is the last kid picked at PE, but this is the one that you're deciding between in that last pick. I think I might give it a C. I might be generous and put it in my C lane just because it is so widely used in the medieval world, and perhaps at a push, I would use that. And our final weapon is the samurai sword. I'm probably going to have to take back many of the things I just said about the Falchion. This could be slightly embarrassing. The samurai sword, common in Japan throughout the medieval period into the early modern period. This is a standard weapon of the fighting classes in Japan, used famously by the samurai. And it's just cool. I mean, samurai swords are just cool. I almost don't care what this rates on any of the measures. I'm going to probably rate it in similar ways to the Falchion, but give it huge marks because it's a samurai sword. Completely unreasonable, right? But my choice. So in terms of rating this then, in terms of its usability, people train their entire lives to make using these an absolute art form. If you know how to use one of these, it's probably one of the most incredibly deadly weapons of the medieval period. And if you don't, you're going to want to take it into the garage and swing it around anyway. It's the medieval equivalent of a lightsaber. Everybody wants a samurai sword. In terms of its usability then, I'm going to imagine I'm a Japanese samurai, and I'm going to give this 9 out of 10 for its usability. In terms of the damage that it could do, I mean, it's a one-edged sword, so it's very similar to the Falchion, except that I feel like this is a much more dangerous and cool weapon. Why do I feel that? I don't know. In terms of the damage that it could do, I guess it's still a sword. It can cause multiple amounts of damage. It's restricted by only having the single edge. So I probably am going to give this a 7 out of 10 for the damage that it could cause. In terms of its versatility, you don't see these very often used in any way but as a sword. You don't see them used across hands to block things, or it doesn't have a pommel on the end that you could use to bludgeon anybody, and that reduces the versatility of it. It's used as a sword and very, very little else. So I guess in terms of its versatility, this might be a 3 out of 10. It's a sword that does the job, but it doesn't do any other job. It could be very similar to a Falchion. Does it belong in our C range of weapons? Well, no, it doesn't, because it's a samurai sword, and my name's Matthew Lewis. This is going somewhere near the very top. The only question for me is whether this is an A or an S, and it's a question that I'm dragging out, maybe for dramatic effect, because there is no doubt in my mind this belongs in the S lane. The samurai sword is perhaps not the most versatile or usable weapon of the medieval period. It doesn't cause as much damage as some of the other things on this table, but it's just so cool. I would want to go into battle with a samurai sword in any fight in the medieval period, just because I think it would make me look good. I hope you've enjoyed me working my way through ranking and rating some medieval weapons. Perhaps you disagree with everything I've done on this table. Perhaps you think a Morningstar should be up in the S lane. Well, let me know in the comments. Tell me what I've got wrong. Make the case for some of these things that I've marked lower down. As always, if you've enjoyed this, please like this video and subscribe to History Hits YouTube channel for more content from the greatest channel in history.